venture fund who's really investing in Africa in order to bring good ideas, good technology back to Japan. So I think it really is like more like multi-directional than like you would think on the surface. But in terms of like the maturity of the venture ecosystem, I think, we've had very few exits. This summer has been positive. There's strong tailwinds there, right? And it's nice to see, Bionic get bought by MFS Africa and Sendwave for 500 million.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of GFA Attract, our interview series where we talk to leaders in the business world about anything and everything. And joining us today from Chicago is Hayden Simmons, the founder of Rallycap Ventures. Hayden, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Tunji.
Very welcome. You can see that is that tea or is that coffee steaming beside you?
It's tea. It's 7:30 in the morning. I'm still waking up.
Okay. Right. So let's just get right into this. So can we just who is Hayden? Can we meet you professionally? What have you been up to in these last few years, and what are you up to currently?
Yeah, sure. My name is Hayden Simmons. I grew up in San Francisco, California. Been working in emerging market fintech for most of my career. Initially did a lot of things in remittances, so was primarily interested in like Filipino and Mexican diaspora communities in the US, and spent a lot of time traveling through Latin America. And then I worked with a company called Juvo for about 4 years. We raised $60 million through our Series B, basically to work through telcos to credit score prepaid subscribers in emerging markets and enable access to consumer financial services like device financing and credit and such. And that took me over to Africa. I started sort of crisscrossing the continent, working with telcos a lot in Southern Africa and East Africa. And then, I eventually sort of burned out on the B2B2C channel, and just telcos are quite slow and deals take a long time to materialize. And I was always curious about the more consumer-facing side of credit. So I actually joined a company called Migo based in Lagos that at the time was the largest consumer lender, to help them expand into Latin America, which is like a really interesting sort of trend we're starting to see as well as African Fintechs looking to expand outside the continent. And like, what does that look like going to Mexico or Brazil? Then I joined Facebook and worked on the Novi team, excuse me, which is basically built on the Libra blockchain. It was called Calibra when I joined, and basically is Facebook's attempt to build, global PayPal, global M-Pesa ecosystem. But in parallel to that, I've really been starting to advise a number of early stage African Fintechs, which led to angel investing, which led to becoming a venture partner at Lateral Capital, a $50 million Africa tech fund, with folks between Lagos, Nairobi, SA, New York, and California, and Tunis now too. In sort of the background of all that, I was always sort of thinking about how I could make the transition into venture. And so once Corona hit and I no longer had to spend 4.5 hours a day on the shuttle going down to Facebook, I had all this free time to finally put the pieces together. And so launched Rallycap this spring. And Rallycap is basically a community of strategic sort of fintech forward operators and founders looking to invest in early stage fintechs between Latin America and Africa. And we're launching Asia as well, Q4 this year. And basically, we invest in sort of a unique manner. We do a fund of funds approach, and so we raise money specifically earmarked for a complementary set of funds that we really like in a region that where there's strong general partners, strong reputation, track record. Founders want to work with them as sort of an entry point, and then obviously those founders and those funds look to access our community of LPs, people from Plaid and Stripe and Facebook and PayPal, for advisory and connections and for co-investment, right? And so it becomes both like a fund of funds vehicle as well as the opportunity to do direct co-investments into deals that we liked. So that's what we're up to. We officially launched, started deploying money in August.
Okay, thanks for that. And currently, how many investments do you have?
So we have six fund investments, and we've done 2 direct deals since we launched in August, and we'll probably continue that pace of doing 1 or 2 direct deals a month. We have some money at Rallycap set aside, where I have sort of full discretion that we can invest directly, but then we also, our LPs, top up in deals that I bring forward, and then they look to basically invest. We build an SPV and invest directly, and so we can sort of do as many of those as there's demand for.
Okay, thank you. Can you just take us through maybe about 2 of the investments so far? What made the proposition actually very interesting to you guys, and what made you guys actually commit to investing?
Yeah, I mean, I really believe in having a sort of thesis-driven approach to investing, versus sort of reactionary or opportunistic. I think it's good to have some money set aside for that in case there's special deals arise. But really, the thesis that guides my thinking in specific to Africa is just a need to first invest, just sort of better APIs and connectivity kind of layers that enable consumer applications to scale better between markets, right? I think the big challenge for a lot of African founders is to figure out how do you get to a large enough addressable market that you can really deliver returns that are attractive to VCs and venture in sort of a Silicon Valley way. And so you have to really piecemeal, separate markets together. It's hard to build a big enough business in a single market, and scale is difficult. And so we really look at what are the APIs that are going to be in the back end of a number of these successful applications in the future, both from a digital identity perspective, payments perspective, cybersecurity, regulatory and licensing. Basically, yeah, what can we do from an API perspective to enable a more efficient expansion and better understanding of consumers? And so the 2 deals that we did, one is in Mono, and Mono is a sort of Plaid for Africa, headquartered in Lagos, and quickly expanding to other markets outside Nigeria. And it's like Plaid, basically the premise is how do you let Fintechs build on top of bank data? And so Abdul, the founder there, has built some really, amazing technology to sort of liberate that consumers' data rather from a bank, so Fintechs can leverage that for a variety of use cases. So very excited about that deal. He did a pre-seed round of $500K, and then another deal that we did that hasn't been announced yet is in a similar space and will be made public in the coming weeks, but is a bit more around multidimensional data, which sounds kind of esoteric, but the idea is how do you bring in data from a lot of sources across banks and MFIs and telcos and Fintechs and wallets and everything else to really build sort of a more unified profile that both those incumbent banks and insurance companies and telcos can use for their own internal purposes, but also external to third-party Fintechs can build on top of. And so, yeah, very excited about both deals.
Okay, thank you for that. Interesting that you mentioned banks. As a growing trend, it seems that banks view Fintechs as a threat, and in some other spaces, banks are actually reaching out to try and work with Fintechs. Where is Africa presently in terms of this?
Yeah, I think it's really a market by market question. And I think open banking isn't something that happens overnight. Open banking sort of referring to the idea that the consumer really owns their data and can bring it with them wherever they choose to go, whether it's another competitive bank, another Fintech, et cetera. And there's standards, right, connecting all these banks so that it's easy to integrate, things are interoperable and move seamlessly between them. Sort of much like sort of ACH, but for information as well, right? Or for NIBS in Nigeria. So I think in Nigeria, very much a strong multi-stakeholder movement towards open banking. but it's going to take time, right? And I think like banks in Nigeria are notorious, and like they've got a lot of power and a lot of regulatory sway, and so nothing's going to happen overnight. And so every investment to work with fintechs really has to like check both boxes and balance that ability to both serve the fintechs and the banks without upsetting the banks, right? And it can't feel fully extractive or like to like OTT over the top, much the way like telcos feel like they got burned by WhatsApp. Similarly here, banks feel like they get burned when somebody's kind of building on top of their rails and extracting everything. So I think there's a lot of like nuance to how you balance those conversations with banks so they fully understand how the consumer data moves in the ecosystem. I think banks aren't going anywhere. And so when fintechs pitch and they're talking about like the growth trajectory of a digital bank or whatever, like sure, but like you look at all the digital banks or the traditional banks in Nigeria that have also launched, mobile banking, right? And like they've got lowest cost of capital, best distribution, best regulatory positioning and licensing and compliance, and like a huge workforce, and can still attract solid talent. So I don't think that like overnight they're disappearing by any means. And I think it's much more, and they play a very crucial role, right? And if you look at like what digital lenders charge and what local banks can charge, banks just don't have the ability to like go downstream to lend necessarily, or the appetite. But I think that there's like things that fintechs can do to enable that sort of opening and broadening of their addressable market, where it's very, very complementary.
Thanks, Hayden. Now, you have deep experience in emerging markets and in fintech. So I wanted to just ask, where is Africa vis-a-vis other emerging markets? What needs to be done from the investment point of view and from the startup founder point of view?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of people are starting to look to Southeast Asia as sort of a paradigm to follow, and thinking, in Africa, we're 5-6 years behind. I think it really depends on like the criteria for the question. Like in many ways, mobile money obviously is born in Africa, in Kenya, and has inspired a lot of innovation outside the continent. And there's been, there's some interesting sort of examples of like Keppel Africa Ventures, which is a big Japanese venture fund, who's really investing in Africa in order to bring good ideas, good technology back to Japan. So I think it really is like more like multi-directional than like you would think on the surface. But in terms of like the maturity of the venture ecosystem, I think, we've had very few exits. This summer has been positive. There's strong tailwinds there, right? And it's nice to see, Bionic get bought by MFS Africa, and Sendwave for $500 million to World Remit. It's sort of a gray area, like Sendwave, like Jumia is an African company, but with foreign shareholders and headquarters and such. But regardless, like as like being in the venture ecosystem, it's something that it's a positive occurrence for all of us to kind of point to. I think to show that there are potential acquisitions and exits for investors, because otherwise, what's the point? And I think everybody needs to see a little more like M&A and consolidation in a number of regards. That's another thing I kind of think about a lot, is like there's a lot of fragmentation in the consumer app side, because it's so easy and cheap to launch an application, like a consumer app now, and there's so much talent. And also during Corona, everybody's got free time. And so, there's 7 Robinhoods for Africa and like 13 Coinbases, and those numbers aren't accurate. There's a lot of each, right? There's sort of infinite ways to send P2P, which from an investor perspective, it's very noisy. Yeah. And the question is always like, how do these things like truly scale? And that scale is still somewhat lacking. And so in terms of like maturity of the ecosystem of where Africa is, relative to other regions, you're not seeing like a new bank emerge, right? And sort of like the neobank, because there's not going to be yet like a market that's big enough to really kind of sustain that. When you drill in from like a Nigerian population of 200 million people down to like 30 something that are maybe addressable for this, like, it's hard to get to like the size that something's happened in like Brazil or now Mexico. Or if you look at like super apps in Southeast Asia, and you look at like Grab and Gojek and these, and everybody kind of wants to replicate that, similarly, like the markets aren't unified enough and to really like generate that much volume to really be like hit that kind of scale. And so I don't think of Africa having to follow a path of other regions. I think it's really going to be a unique direction that it takes, and it's still sort of finding itself and finding its footing. And there will be some influences from Southeast Asia and some from Latin America, some from US and Europe, but I wouldn't over-index on any other region too strongly.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to what you said, in terms of the ecosystem and development. However, let's go back a bit more. You talked about founders in terms of when perhaps they're pitching to investors and they're talking about maybe a digital bank and they're talking about scaling in this direction onto this height within this particular timeline. In terms of reality, when founders come to you talking about scaling up business models, what do you advise them to do in terms of actually being in touch with reality and not just talking about things that are pretty much unachievable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I always talk about like the sort of fairy tale of being Pan-African. And it goes both ways, right? Like I think a lot of venture funds talk about being Pan-African. Then you drill in and you look at where capital's been deployed, and it's going to look a lot like what we all know. It's going to be a lot of Nigeria, a little Kenya, and a little SA. And now maybe, yeah, right. And it's very little money is going specifically to like Uganda or Zim or whatever. On the flip side of that, you do see a lot of decks, right, where people are like, okay, we're this for Africa, we're that for Africa, we're going to be Pan-African. And just the reality is that I sort of started talking about at the beginning of the show, it's just so hard to stitch together all these markets and expand from one to the next, right? And if like, especially in fintech, where I'm primarily focused, and there's like compliance and regulatory kind of questions, it's hard to justify, right, going to like launch in like a Rwanda and a Nigeria if the cost of launching is similar, but the upside is so dramatically different that you end up with a lot of saturation in the big markets and much less innovation in the smaller markets. And so I think it's refreshing when a founder is honest, right, about this is the path we're taking, and we're starting in this market, and this is why. And these are the next markets, and this is why we can think we can win in those markets. And having like a very educated and informed sort of strategy around how you're actually gonna build up the presence in those new markets. Because it's really easy to say, yeah, we'll just do Nigeria next. As everybody knows that's ever launched anything in Nigeria, it's an extremely hard place to do business and launch things. And there's a huge preference for Nigerian solutions, right? And so like, how do you reconcile that? It goes in every direction. Yeah. Same thing, going to figure out M-Pesa after you've launched in Nigeria without mobile money. Or if you start in Kenya and you build on top of M-Pesa, because then it's the ubiquity of the mobile money platform is amazing and you can just get to scale quickly. It's then all of a sudden you're trying to go to another non-M-Pesa market, which is the rest of Africa outside of maybe Tanzania, which is a tough place to do business, especially right now. It takes a lot of localization and a lot of changes to your approach to figure out these other markets. So I think that's like a key one that's always sort of like either a red flag or like bonus points when someone's pitching me, is like just how honest and educated are they around the sort of Pan-African aspirations.
Okay, all right. So now let's go back to ecosystem development. Now, a couple of countries in Africa, Senegal, Tunisia, I think first, and Rwanda most recently, have pushed an initiative in terms of a startup act. On a policy level, and you also mentioned the difficulty of exits as well. So on a policy level and government level, what would you like to see in Africa in terms of development and in terms of showing investors that, hey, we know that you guys are here, we know that you guys are taking these risks, and we're looking out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like having the clear communication is super helpful, right? Like, I mean, I was at Facebook, and they're not a startup by any means, and we're figuring out Novi's ability to launch in other markets, and like just the ambiguity around like crypto rules in each market just generates a lot of confusion and uncertainty. And in many ways, that's kind of what the banks want, right? They're like, well, the regulators might not come out and say yes or no, but like if they don't say anything, then at least like that ambiguity is a positive, right? And sort of slows innovation, gives them a chance to sort of catch up. The flip side is true too. Some startups that feel like they can absorb the risk say, okay, the ambiguity's is nice cover, and like we are going to fly under the radar. And once we get big enough, then they'll pay attention to us, and we'll deal with that sort of conflict at that point, cross that bridge when we get there. For me, from an investor perspective, obviously like clarity is always preferred. And so, which is different. Like I'm sort of new to this side of the table, having been on the operating side for the last decade, where the ambiguity is just part and parcel of all of startup world. So I think like having some clarity when a company's like, yeah, we're going to go figure out this license and that's a lot of risk, right? And if they don't get it and they can't launch, like that's a huge threat to the business and the investment that we've made. So certainly having like more clarity, I think, around a lot of pieces around like licensing, I think, and a lot of the crypto stuff definitely attracts a lot of the conversation around on this topic. But I think it's the same thing for a lot of things, just from like on identity basis and governments and policy be able to focus on like, building like a really strong sort of biometric digital identity policy becomes something that's like a huge enabling factor for startups to succeed. If you look at Ghana, I think they're just doing amazing things, right? Around like both on like biometrics and identity, as well as like instant payments domestically, and sort of trying to combat MTN's monopolistic sort of trends, right? And trying to avoid an M-Pesa reality, I think is smart. And I think finding more countries that sort of have that proactive approach to like interoperability, and like leveling the playing field is great. And you see banks and fintechs succeeding alongside each other there more than you would elsewhere.
Right. Thank you. Okay, a more specific question, and this is for entrepreneurs in the house who are going to watch this. So you're in fintech, right? We see a lot of African startups having an overdependence on like apps. It's their apps. But behind the scenes, the business models are very weak. What advice do you have for founders to actually improve on this?
Yeah, I think I drive a lot of founders crazy by having this conversation with them. Like, look, it's really hard to differentiate between, a bunch of the like let's say, we want to make an investment in like the crypto space, and there's 7 apps that all have the same functionality. Yeah, and they're all like, yeah, we've had a few conversations, like, let's move forward. And it's like, sure, but like there's just so much convergence and sort of groupthink on these applications that it's hard to like figure out who's really going to win, right? And so the consumer application space is just hyper fragmented and competitive right now, as we talked about. Just it's in some ways it's great, right? Like the barriers to launching an app, learning how to code, putting the team together, releasing it, seeing if there's traction, like super low, right? And so, it's sort of different, I think, in the US, like where people launch apps, a lot of apps, like just sort of as a side project, right? And then like with traction, maybe monetize with like ads, and then and that's sort of like a very different path, right? And in the African context, I think that's much less likely, right? And I think like the ad tech ecosystem, which is already like fraught with fraud and not a great paradigm to follow, like is not mature enough to really support that model. And so like we do tend to look more at like the B2B side of things, because it's just an easier signal, right? You're like, well, if we're in the B2B and everybody's using our app, our API, we can see which apps are actually succeeding. We can see whose volumes and transactions are real, whose is not. And you're also just de-risked and diversified across all the apps. So, I think that does drive founders crazy a little bit when they're like, yeah, but our app is, we need some money, and we've got a lot of users and stuff. It's like, the big question always is like, okay, but like what happens next, right? And you see, without naming names, like you see some valuations on certain apps where it's just sort of mind-boggling, right? When you actually factor in like what's the CAC and the LTV and like what's the disposable income of the average Nigerian, this should not have the same trading value as like a digital bank in the UK, where people have much more disposable money. So it's not to say that they're like, I'm not saying I'm short on the consumer apps at all. Like I think that's really obviously, a big reason I'm investing so much time and energy into the continent. But I think like unless you're doing something truly differentiated, you kind of have to recognize that it's going to be harder to raise the money and separate yourself from the pack. Right. And that's the other thing on like the B2C versus B2B in the multi-markets is like, if you're building a digital bank, let's say in South Africa, but you want to launch it in like whatever, Kenya too. If you're a Kenyan, you don't really care that there's like, that someone in South Africa can also use the same banking app. But like you as the founder are pitching it as Pan-African because like that's the way you raise money. So there's a little bit of like a disconnect there as well that comes back to like the fragmentation of the continent.
Okay, all right, thank you. We're rounding up now. So outside of Rallycap, outside of making money, outside of being an investor, what else Hayden get up to? Hobbies, books, sports?
Yeah, I'm a big rock climber. Spend a lot of time climbing. Love playing the guitar. And right now, just really enjoying the flexibility of not having to go to a specific office every day. And so my wife and I have been traveling around the U.S. quite a bit. Maybe go to Mexico next. And yeah, just embracing life before kids with full flexibility and decent Wi-Fi. You can do deals from anywhere.
Interesting you mentioned rock climbing. There's this gentleman that climbed. He has this record in terms of time he climbed this rock face. I think it was the Yosemite Park. What's his name again?
In Yosemite?
Yeah, Yosemite, yeah.
For the speed climb, probably a Tommy Caldwell?
No, it's not him. It's, I can't remember his name.
Alex Honnold is a popular climber.
Arnold, yeah.
He wasn't a speed. He's not about speed. He's just the first guy to do it with no ropes.
No ropes, yeah. Yes, and a documentary was made about him.
Yeah, different climbing than I'll ever do.
No. Okay, so we're waiting for you to attempt the same record. Let us know so that GFA can get it.
Yeah, I'll give you the exclusive footage. Yeah.
Thanks. So last question, what advice do you have for Get Funded Africa? What do you think we're doing right?
No, I think this is great. I think having more and more conversations between candid conversations between founders and investors is just super healthy for the ecosystem. And the more communication there is, the better all the moving pieces fit together.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Hayden.
Yeah, thanks, Tunji.
We really appreciate you. When next you're in Africa, let us know. And we wish you all the best.
Absolutely.
Rallycap Ventures. Thank you so much.
You as well. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. Hello.